Good afternoon, welcome to another A-Push video with Mr. Pate. Today we're looking at Native Americans in the Great Plains. And our essential question is, why did government policy change several times? This might be very confusing to you, so let's take a look. Well, culture on the Great Plains. When we're talking about culture of the Native Americans, you're talking about different Native American tribes on the Great Plains, which is extending from kind of western Minnesota down into Kansas and maybe even, certainly through Oklahoma and maybe northern Texas and out west even, toward the Rocky Mountains. For the Great Plains, you have Native American groups. The largest and probably the best known is the Sioux Indians, which is kind of a conglomeration of a number of tribes that would be like Lakotas or Dakotas or different groups that are all within the kind of umbrella of being the Sioux Indians. But they're going to have a culture that's based around the buffalo. It's a nomadic culture. They're going to travel to water sources and where the buffalo would be, and that was a lot of their food source. They were not planted in one area as farmers or something like that. So they're on the move. They had their own religion. They had their own cultural customs. And what you're going to see is this comes into some conflict with white settlers and the government. Reasons that Native Americans were pushed off of the land. Well, there are a bunch of reasons that they're going to be pushed off the land. I think a couple of big things for you to keep in mind. You have mining strikes that are going to be found. You have cattle ranchers with the long drive down in kind of the southern portion of the Great Plains. You are going to have homesteading white settlers, and you're going to have the railroads. All four of these groups, miners looking for metal strikes, the ranchers taking cattle on the long drive, and farmers wanting to go out and have their own land in the west, and the railroads crisscrossing across as more and more transcontinental railroads are formed, that these are all going to be reasons. And the United States wants to support the white settlers by giving them that land. They want to support the railroads by giving them that land. And so they're going to be pushed off of land for those four key reasons. Why did Native Americans lose? Well, there are going to be a couple of things. By the time the Civil War is over, in the mid-1860s, you have a pretty well-oiled war machine for the Union. You have a lot of troops that are pretty darn well trained. You have a lot of weaponry, and military technology continues to improve. Okay, you're going to have things come along like the Winchester repeating rifle, and that is going to be significant because the reloading and refiring process is so much faster. Every soldier with a Winchester repeating rifle is going to be able to get a lot more shots off than a Native American with a more basic rifle or with a bow and arrow. They're going to have really no chance because of the repetitions, and again, those troops have training. And kind of the pattern of how things would go is you would have white settlers or miners or whoever move into an area, and you'd have conflict develop, and then the army would get sent in, and you'd have more conflict develop between the army and the Native American group, that eventually enough army would be there that they would force surrender after defeating Native American tribe, unless the tribe, agreed to move before taking a huge devastating defeat. Alright, so those are main reasons that the Native Americans lost. There are a couple of other things that factor into that too. The destruction of the buffalo. The buffalo, as I said before, was central to the lifestyle and just the whole way that Native Americans operated. And you're going to have buffaloes killed for meat, a lot of them killed for their fur, some of them killed just to undermine the Native American lifestyle. That nomadic lifestyle, when you have homesteading farmers putting up barbed wire fencing, when you have railroads coming through, when you have towns developing, these things are all infringing on our ability to have a nomadic lifestyle as well. So these are all reasons that Native Americans are going to lose. You've got the army and the might of the army and their machinery and weaponry, but you also have kind of the undermining of the buffalo and just the inability to continue a nomadic lifestyle. So I wrote down first reservation system 1860s and 1870s. we know that the first reservation system is going to be before that. The Indian Removal Act that Andrew Jackson does in the 1830s is going to be, taking five civilized tribes out of Georgia and Florida down in the southeastern United States, moving them out to Oklahoma, which at that time was considered the Great American Desert and undesirable land. Well, you're going to see the first reservation system now that we're talking about is going to be kind of an official systematic removing of Native American tribes from the plains in the Southwest and putting them into designated zones or reservations that they would live on. Obviously there's some things going on. They're kind of being forced into these reservations, and it's far less land than they had before, and they're, it's taken away from a nomadic lifestyle because they can't travel all over state to state, in what they eventually become called. So the first reservation system takes away a lot of land and concentrates their population in a smaller area, and they have to stay there. And the United States would make treaties where they promised to leave them alone. That's going to be key here in a minute. They'd leave them alone if they would stay in the reservation. That was the deal. Well, later on, 1887, you had some people, you had two different factions behind the Dawes Severalty Act, which is an assimilation plan. It is an idea that you're going to Americanize the Native Americans. So the first thing that's happening with this Dawes Severalty Act, you have some people whose motivation is to say, let's bring them into society. Andrew Jackson, he had always said, we could never ever have coexistence between Native Americans and white Americans. Not going to happen. Well, the Dawes Severalty Act, some of the people who want this are saying, let's make it happen. Let's Christianize them, let's give them a Western education, let's teach them how to farm, and they'll dress like white Americans, and basically they can give up their cultural lifestyle, but they will get a chance to then be fully functional members of society. And they would each be given, as a part of the Dawes Severalty Act, a homestead area. Now, the other people's motivation is this is another chance to take even more land away from the Native Americans, because the homesteading amount for each Native American family actually amounted to less total land, so more land would be taken away from the Native American tribes through this. While some people were well-intentioned behind the Dawes Severalty Act, others were not, of course. It's going to be undermined by the Bureau of Indian Affairs having a lot of corrupt officials who are going to basically, instead of, in good faith, the Dawes Severalty Act outlined that Native American families would be given supplies and seed and tools and an ability to basically have a good start at learning how to farm and doing that lifestyle. But then people who work for the Bureau of Indian Affairs would steal a lot of the supplies and products they were supposed to get, so they never really had a fair chance to get those things. Okay, well, all of this gets chronicled then by Helen Hunt Jackson, who writes a book called A Century of Dishonor. Now, I've listed this here because when books are in the context of what's being discussed, I think it's a powerful way for you as a student to remember what the book is about. So when you had Uncle Tom's Cabin in the early 1850s, and we talked about how it referenced the fugitive slave law and how it led to all these other problems leading toward the Civil War, that gives you the context for Uncle Tom's Cabin. Likewise, common sense before the American Revolution begins. Okay. Well, A Century of Dishonor, hopefully this helps you keep it in mind. Helen Hunt Jackson chronicles from early colonial times, state to state, Georgia in the 1830s, Colorado in the 1880s, how states were systematically undermining Native Americans, taking their land, how federal policy was unfair to Native Americans, and it is important to note that as skirmishes would happen and white settlers or miners or whoever moved in, you would have attacks by white settlers on Native Americans, you would have attacks by Native Americans on white settlers. So it's not entirely a one-way street. I want to make that clear. But, the government's policy is systematically going to be pushing back and removing land from Native Americans. So that's A Century of Dishonor, and it becomes one of these influential books. The Jungle, we're going to talk about that when we get to the Progressive Era and the Muckrakers. Silent Spring, we'll talk about that in the 1960s for the environmental movement. So this becomes one of those books that is fairly influential and notable. The Indian New Deal. The Indian New Deal is going to be in 1934, and it's going to be something passed by FDR and the Democratic Congress, and basically it is going to restore of land taken away, this additional land in the Dawes Severalty Act. 2 million acres go back to the Native Americans. A second reservation system is created, and the government is going to agree, without saying we have wronged you in the past. They're going to agree to give Native American tribes, to give them infrastructure development, which is sewer, power, things like that, education, healthcare improvements on their reservations to kind of help them have a better opportunity to be successful then. That does not end all of the problems for Native Americans, the residual problems from having their culture and lifestyle all changed. But you're going to see further efforts where special allowances are made to Native Americans closer to the end of the 1900s in terms of allowing casinos to be built, that only Native Americans be given that opportunity as a way to financially restore themselves. So, why did government policy change several times? That's our essential question. The reason it changed several times is, you had the first reservation system with the motivation of moving Native Americans away from where white settlers would want to be. They generally get undesirable land and a lot less of it. The Dawes Severalty Act, well-intentioned by some, others trying to take even more land, but it's a clear recognition that the first reservation system wasn't working very well. And then the Indian New Deal with the second reservation system clearly shows that the Dawes Severalty Act was a failure, and that's fairly close to what we have today. But that's all the time we have for today. Stay classy.